Welcome to Bookshopaholics, our new series of occasional episodes here at the Book Club Review podcast, where we get to indulge in our love of independent bookshops and meet the owners of some of our favourites. I'm Kate, and I began my bookshop adventures with the Paperhound, a new, used and rare bookstore in downtown Vancouver, run by Kim Koch and Rod Clarke. Their stock is eclectic and favours, as they say, the classic, curious, odd, beautiful, visually arresting, scholarly, bizarre and whimsical. In this episode, I'll be chatting to Kim and picking out some books from her shelves and sharing my finds with you. We'll also get to discover some of her favourites too. And so, come book shopping with me as I visit the Paperhound. On a nondescript street, close to Vancouver's historic downtown, nestled in between tall buildings, a wooden greyhound and a cart of hardback books marked $1 each lets you know that you have arrived at the Paperhound. Going in, you find a high-ceilinged room lined with tall bookshelves, each shelf filled with beautiful old spines. The shelf marks are quite singular, particularly in the children's section, where we have Indomitable Orphans, Rodents as Hero, Books with Bears, whole section of Books with Bears. And then going on through, there's a section, Prescriptions and Advice. And then above that, Getting High, which is psychedelics. And then above that, Getting Higher, which is books on astronomy. And then my favourite section in the shop is called Polar Peril, which is sort of Arctic memoirs. And near that I could see Wet Adventure, which is sort of seafaring books. And then as you go round, there's a beautiful letterpress poster of George Orwell's famous essay, Bookshop Memories, hanging on the wall, next to a display of paper ephemera. Little receipts, letters, notes, all on this sort of old yellowing paper, the sort of things that fall out of old books. There's also a table with a collection of new books, all the more interesting because it's such a small selection, and so you sense that it's been very carefully chosen. Above all, everything in the shop is suffused with that intoxicating smell of old books that owner Kim Koch says she can no longer detect. Kim, thanks so much for having us. So tell us about your book-selling career and how you came to set up the Paperhound.
Rod and I opened the bookshop in 2013, but we previously had been co-workers just down the block at McLeod's Books. I was there for 10 years. Rod was there for 6 or 7, I think. I've been working in books since 1999 in various bookstores. Rod has been working in bookstores, I think, since about 1982. So we have a lot of years in the trade under our belts. But this particular spot is where we've landed.
We should perhaps have a quick sidebar just to tell listeners about McLeod's, which I think is a bit of a Vancouver institution, isn't it?
It's legendary, yeah. So McLeod's is just down the street on West Pender and Richards, and West Pender has traditionally been the book row of Vancouver. It's hard to describe it as that now because there's really just us and McLeod's, but there used to be about a dozen bookstores around here. McLeod's is that kind of romantic, very chaotic, books to the ceiling type of place.
So then you wanted to maybe have your own place, or what was the impulse that made you want to start your own place, really just a stone's throw away from McLeod's?
There was a parting of ways at McLeod's, and it soon became pretty apparent to me that I didn't have any other career skills. I couldn't get another job. I just couldn't. I was basically unemployable. And I'd gone all this time thinking that I was employable. I thought I was kind of smart and I thought that I knew how to deal with people. You do pick up on all of these very specific but very hard to articulate skills working in a chaotic antiquarian bookstore. But they just don't read well for HR departments. There's kind of a straight world and a crooked world, and the straight world does not see working at McLeod's Books for a decade to be the fast track to corporate success. So after leaving McLeod's, I swiftly realized that I didn't have a lot of prospects, but I really missed working in a bookstore and what I wanted to do, and I think what I was kind of good at. And so Rod and I had been very good friends at McLeod's, and we had often talked about what we would do, if this was our shop, what would we do differently, things like that. And this sort of came about. We just managed to articulate a vision and decided to go for it. It felt like a huge risk, and I'm a really risk-averse person, but we just came up with a plan, and we had a lot of support from some friends of ours who are in publishing who were really cheering us on. We had a lot of books already, and then we found this space, and we were like, well, let's just do it. And it worked out, which is incredible.
And in your career as a bookseller, I believe you've sort of become... There are some sort of archetypal images of you floating around the internet. I think if you Google woman surrounded by books, there is this one black and white picture of this very attractive woman surrounded by books that turned out to be you. And that's not the only picture of you in a bookstore that's made it into popular consciousness. Tell me about this.
Well, I mean, these were all surprises for me. The internet burbles up something every once in a while. And McLeod's is a very photogenic space. There's a lot of film action that happens in Vancouver, and film people always say, oh, you can't set deck something to look like this. Like, it's its own creation. And so there is a photo of me at McLeod's that I only found out about last year. Thanks for describing it that way. It's, it was kind of surprising to see it. And then I found another one yesterday. Maybe that's what you're referring to, because I posted it online. I don't know what to say about it. McLeod's is a very special place, and I was very lucky to get to work there for such a long time.
I mean, I'm tempted if I could perhaps get you to pose it. Maybe I could take a photo of you, and then I could start selling it.
Well, I would say, I think that we have a very attractive bookstore, but I don't think that it has the zhuzh of McLeod's, because it's quite orderly. Everything's off the ground. There's not stacks to the ceiling. Like, it's got a look. And it's nice, but I like chaos and I like anarchy. And I'm a digger. I love the digging and the dust and the grime and excavating and tunneling around like a mole person for the right thing. So there's some romance to that, I guess.
Well, tell us more about the mechanics of it. Where do the books come from? Do you spend a lot of time seeking them out? Do people know now if they have collections to sell that you would be interested? How does it work?
Yeah, people do call us up all the time and contact us when they have libraries to sell. So we buy collections large and small. Sometimes somebody just has a single book, and sometimes somebody has a house full of books. We get books that way. We also scout our own stock, which often involves going to a book sale or a library sale or charity shop or whatever. There's no end to places where books emerge, and sometimes they surprise you. Once I was biking home and I saw a box of books at the side of the road and it said free books, and I stopped and took a look. And in it, amongst all this junk, there was a signed copy of Borges' Ficciones, which is incredible, right?
That's really?
Yeah, I know. That doesn't happen every day. But I did go, like, knock, knock, knock on the door of the house, and you cough up some cash when you when you find something like that. There are great books everywhere. There's also a lot of really crummy books everywhere, and most books are kind of crummy books. And so it's really about parsing the crummy from the good and knowing the difference. Again, this won't impress anybody in HR, but if I had a secret talent, it's that I can walk into any thrift store with 1,000 books on a wall, and I can spend half an hour or less and find the 3 books that are worthwhile in those 1,000 books, right? It's a feel that you get. It's a vibe.
And then that is a very useful skill if you own and run a used bookstore.
It is. Well, and it keeps things fun. It's lively.
And tell us about your customers. I was struck by your lovely poster you've got on the wall back there of George Orwell's famous essay, Bookshop Memories.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to read a little bit from that. He begins, "When I worked in a second-hand bookshop, so easily pictured, if you don't work in one, as a kind of paradise where charming old gentlemen browse eternally among calf-bound folios, the thing that chiefly struck me was the rarity of really bookish people. Our shop had an exceptionally interesting stock, yet I doubt whether 10% of our customers knew a good book from a bad one. First edition snobs were much commoner than lovers of literature, but Oriental students haggling over cheap textbooks were commoner still, and vague-minded women looking for birthday presents for their nephews were commonest of all. Many of the people who came to us were of the kind who would be a nuisance anywhere, but have special opportunities in a bookshop. For example, the dear old lady who wants a book for an invalid, a very common demand that, and the other dear old lady who read such a nice book in 1897 and wonders whether you can find her a copy. Unfortunately, she doesn't remember the title, or the author's name, or what the book was about, but she does remember that it had a red cover. But apart from these, there are 2 well-known types of pest by whom every second-hand bookshop is haunted. One is the decayed person smelling of old bread crusts who comes every day, sometimes several times a day, and tries to sell you worthless books. The other is the person who orders large quantities of books for which he has not the smallest intention of paying. So tell me about your customers. Are they true bookish people? Do they tend to be collectors or regulars? Are you nice to them?
Well, they run the gamut. I mean, there's still a lot of accuracy to what Orwell wrote, and I often turn back to the line about people who would be a nuisance anywhere, but bookshops give them special opportunities like that. It just glimmers with truth. But our customers, we see a lot of tourists because we're downtown and we're located underneath the hotel. So we get a lot of people who have that feeling of, here I am in Vancouver. There's a thing that I might never see again. So there's that fleeting sense of something shiny, and that is a kind of customer that we have. And I really appreciate those people because in this day and age, there's a generic quality to everything that's on offer in retail. And so there's something special about people who know that they might walk out the door and never see something again and are willing to buy it. There's also a lot of students. We also have scholarly types. There's 2 major universities in Vancouver, and it's nice to be able to be close to academics who are looking for things, especially since we specialize in literature and poetry. So we sell a lot of that. There's some parts of that Orwell quote that are a little bit sus now. But by and large, it's true. Even the breadcrumb smell and the little old ladies and stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
I think that classic thing about, well, I read a book. Can you help me find it? I can't remember the name. I can't remember the title. I just remember the color was red. I mean, that's true of every single bookshop in the world, isn't it?
That's really true. A lot of people give dimensions. Like they try to get, it's sort of like 6.5 by 3. And that's not how I organize things. But, you know, I appreciate it. Everybody has a quest. And if it's a book that you remember from your youth and you're haunted by it, it does keep you walking into used bookstores, which I think is a great way to live your life. And so I encourage people to seek out the book that they have no clue what it actually is. It enriches your life to go into bookstores and look at all the things that aren't the thing that you're looking for.
You have a small, carefully curated selection of new books at the back of the shop. What guides you when you're choosing that new stock?
Oh, yeah. That's probably the thing that's been in the most flux over the last decade, because when we opened, we were trying to just have the books that people are always looking for in used bookstores and that often aren't there. Things like, say, Gravity's Rainbow or 1984, Slaughterhouse-Five. There's these sorts of books that people expect to find in a used bookstore, and because they expect to find them there, they often aren't there because there's just not enough supply to meet the demand. So we were trying to fill those gaps. And then over time, various things have happened in Vancouver. One is that the big box bookstore, which in Canada is called Chapters Indigo, their downtown location closed down. And so all of a sudden, unexpectedly, we found ourselves being the only bookstore in downtown Vancouver, kind of a major city, that sold new books. And so then we were trying to bring in the popular things that people liked. But the people who are buying the popular stuff are kind of fair weather customers because you can get that stuff pretty cheap on Amazon. You can buy it at Costco even. And so we settled on bringing in things that we thought were cool and that we wanted to see circulating secondhand. You're sort of at the, if you think of like it as a digestive system or something, like what do you want to eat to see it come out later, right? As a secondhand book. And so, sorry, I hadn't given any thought to that metaphor before I said it. It's disgusting.
I love it though. I never thought of it that way.
No,
it's right.
But it's also kind of awful. Edit it out and think of something better.
I don't know if I can. I like it too much.
Okay, all right, keep it in. We try to bring in things like world literature and translation, interesting classics that have been reprinted, a lot of academic press stuff, things that you're not likely to find everywhere. When you're mostly dealing in secondhand stuff, you actually become pretty in tune with the fact that the publishing industry is really unsustainable in a lot of ways. You see these big lean-ins to things like Prince Harry's memoir, things that aren't going to have a second life. They're so ephemeral. They have their moment in the sun, they make a ton of money, and then they get dumped. And so when you're the person who sees all the stuff that gets dumped, you become very skeptical and very cynical quite quickly, which is why I had to explain this several times today. We don't have a business section or a finance section or a self-help section. All of these sections that really, these books have kind of a blink and you miss it lifespan. So we try to, when we bring in new books, we try to look for things that maybe have legs, that have some staying power, or that we think people will be interested in 5 or 10 years down the road, so that we're not contributing to this big wasteland of books that have been read once and discarded.
I love this. This is making me think twice about the books that I'm buying from my home library. I might have to stop being so casual about it. No more Thursday Murder Club for me. And how about your own reading? Do you manage to find time to read? And if you do, what sorts of books are you drawn to?
Oh, I do read. I probably don't read as much as people think I read, and I'm probably not as well read as people think I am, which is like a scandalous admission. But I know a lot about books that I haven't read, which is the real trick. But I do read. I read mostly fiction and poetry. I guess I read the kind of stuff that we sell here. But I also like the odd mystery. I don't read a lot of science fiction. I don't read a lot of graphic novels. I do read a lot of children's books. I'm a real dilettante. There's not one thing that I read a lot of.
All right, shall we go and have a little browse through the shelves and see what we can find? Kim, I'd love it if you could pull out some of your favourites, maybe a curiosity that you love or something that has special value, and maybe one new book. We'll meet back here in 10 minutes and we can compare notes. Okay, so we're back and we've each got a stack of 3 books here. Kim, what's on the top of your pile? It looks like something old.
It is old. It's a little old book called A Little Book of Pussycats. This just came in today, so it's at the forefront of my mind, which is why I chose it. And it is illustrated by Wain. Do you know about Wain? He's sort of the cat illustrator. And I feel like because of the role that cats play in popular culture these days, he's sort of the godfather of internet cat appeal. He did these very human-like cats doing crazy things. So this is a very little book, and it has a lovely little inscription in it. Vivian from his mummy in 1910. And it has a bunch of little poems that are not credited to anyone, and then these little pussycat illustrations throughout it. And Wain is very interesting, too, because he was institutionalized, I think, for schizophrenia, like in the 1920s. And his images of cats have this arc to them where they went from being very traditional kitty cats to being slightly kooky humanoid cats to being fairly psychedelic cats with crazy faces. He's known for that deterioration of mental health that was accompanied by this sort of blossoming of a wild illustration style. I've never seen this book before. It's quite rare, and I was excited to see it today, so I thought I'd mention it.
And would that be valuable? I can see it's quite precious, but in monetary terms, is it valuable?
In monetary terms, we have it priced at $275. It does have a slight lean to the binding, but otherwise it's very good. And so that's a fairly expensive book by most people's standards.
Yes, it's a very small, slim little volume. And when something like that comes along, then can you see it, you sort of immediately mentally can slot that into what you know about him, what you know about his work, what you know about what's out there?
Yeah, you know these things about the illustrator. You know that you haven't seen this before, which indicates a kind of scarcity. And there's a real slippery slope with scarcity in books, right? Like there's unusual things, there's genuinely rare things where there's only 2 or 3 known examples, or things that only come to auction every once in a while. And then there's books that are like this, that are unusual and desirable, that have some sort of cultural cachet, and that you know have an appeal. And so this one, it checks a few boxes for us.
Tell us about something you've had in that is really exciting and special and valuable.
I did a house call out in Point Grey, which is by the university, a few years ago. And it was a big collection that had belonged to a professor, and it was mostly Canlit, Canadian literature. But there was this one outlier, which was volume 2 of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and it was the 1819 edition. I believe it was 1819. It was the second edition. But it was just volume 2, which is so vexing, right? Like when you have an incomplete set, but of something that's very good. It's very hard to sell volume 2 without volume 1. But on the other hand, it's not something that you can just consigned to the rubbish bin because it's an important book and it's a rare book. It took me about a week to clear this library, and it was a heat wave. It was really uncomfortable. I was in this basement for just days on end. This one book that was stuck out so much from everything else that was in the collection, I just couldn't find volume 1. And okay, so whatever, the owner of these books had actually died 40 years before. So there was no one to talk to about them. And then I came back just to wrap things up, return the keys to the daughters. And I did one last pass, and I went into the furnace room for some reason. And just on a whim, I put my hand on top of the furnace, which was covered in dust. And there was volume 1 of the second edition of Frankenstein. I have no idea what it was doing up there. Like, everything else was quite orderly. There's no explanation for it. So then I had this complete set, and I whooped, I yelled. That was quite special. I ended up selling it to another dealer who turned around and sold it to one of my customers, which is just the funny, incestuous way things work around here. But that was a special book and quite an expensive book. I guess it happened in 2018 because I remember it was just before the centennial of the book being published.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Wow. That must have been quite a moment.
Yes.
All right. My curiosity, I suppose I found, I was attracted both by the title, but also by the image on the front cover. It's called Aphrodisiacs in Your Garden by Charles Connell. And it's got a really wonderful Quentin Blake illustration on the cover of a man holding a watering can in one hand and a naked woman in the other. But then I opened it and I read the flyleaf, and it says, "This book is intended for everyone with an interest in sex and the possibilities of making it even more agreeable than it undoubtedly is. Addressing himself mainly to those men who are not entirely happy about their virility, the author suggests that the remedy lies in their own hands. Since every Englishman is a born gardener, he can grow his own sexual restoratives and stimulants in the form of aphrodisiacs. Fruits, flowers, herbs, and vegetables that for thousands of years have been used to inflame and sustain desire." Although his approach to the subject is fundamentally light-hearted, the author presents an authentic account of the reputed effects of the various love-provoking plants, and includes a good deal of genuinely practical advice concerning their cultivation and how to utilise them in aphrodisiac dishes. There are useful hints for the suburban gardener, the flat dweller, the man in the basement room, the specialist in herbs, indeed for everybody who has some space somewhere for growing exciting and invigorating crops. Now, clearly this is incredibly un-PC, but it's just, I love it. I love everything about it.
Yeah, it's very special. I mean, I think the only thing that's un-PC about it is that it doesn't acknowledge a woman's need for an aphrodisiac once in a while, right? But the Quentin Blake illustration on the front is fantastic.
It's absolutely wonderful. There's a whole section on radishes.
Oh, what do the radishes?
Did you know that radishes were aphrodisiacs?
No, tell me more.
Well, the Greeks thought they were.
Oh.
The popularity of the radish as a vegetable goes back to the days of the ancient Egyptians and Greeks. In the 5th century BC, the former had concocted an aphrodisiac made of radishes mixed with honey. Some commentators believe that Heliodorus was referring to a dish of radishes served at a marriage feast when he wrote, "Great deeds need great preparations."
I'll buy it.
Normally, radishes are either eaten whole with salt or sliced and added to salads. In his De Re Coquinaria, Apicius assures us that they have a beneficial effect on sexually sluggish natures. So next time some Cressida voices the familiar complaint that all lovers swear more performance than they are able and yet reserve an ability that they never perform, the remedy is a simple one. Chew 2 or 3 dozen radishes and then give her the lie. That's an interesting euphemism, isn't it? Give her the lie. Anyway, yes, as you say, it's a very male-centric view, but it seems quite a generous one for all that. How much are you charging for this one?
I think we have $15 on that one. Yeah.
I'd
Minus the dust jacket, it would be much, much less.
$15 for something that's basically priceless. What's next in your stack? That's a new book, is it?
Yes, I have a new book here. And so this book, it's not that new anymore. I think this was published about 2 or 3 years ago. And it is called Minor Detail by Adania Shibley. And this is a book that I would really recommend to anyone who aspires to write, because it is such a well-written book. And it's a very thin little book. It's only 100 pages. It has this formal quality where it is divided into, there's 50 pages to both sides. It tells a very, very grim story about the Nakba which is like a genocide of the Palestinian people in the 1960s. But it's told from two sides. It's told through the experiences, this very Kafkaesque kind of mental decay of this Israeli officer who is just falling to pieces during this kidnap and torture and rape of this Palestinian girl. And then on the other side, it takes place in the present with this Palestinian woman who I think is neurodivergent in a certain way. And it's her experience of navigating all of the obstacles that are in her path and sharing this sort of spiritual, mental kinship with the woman at the beginning of the story. It's done very tightly. The writing is superb. I don't want to say too much about it, except that if you write, or if you aspire to write, or if you love great writing, this does it. Like, it does it, and it does that thing of humanizing a horrifying event in a way that is actually a revelation. I'm only really pitching it here because you've given me a platform to pitch it, because when people ask for recommendations and you're like, yeah, how about this 100-page novel about the rape and torture of a Palestinian girl? Like, most of them are like, no, I was thinking of something lighter. But it's so good. And I think it's a really important book. It's published by New Directions, who seem to publish everything that is really excellent these days in translation, and I would really recommend it. I don't know who publishes it in the UK. Probably somebody else.
I think it might be Fitzcarraldo.
Okay.
It just feels very Fitzcarraldo-y to me. Yeah. I will check. But yeah, because I have heard of that one, and I think possibly that's why I know it.
It's a nice little book. I recommend.
And sometimes with books like that, the subject can be difficult. The pleasure is all in, as you say, the way it's written and experiencing.
It's crafted so well. She's such a good writer, and she has done it in such a minimal way. So it's not a pleasure to read, but it is very inspiring to see such a deft hand at work. I know that that's not what everybody reads for, and that's the struggle with giving a recommendation, is trying to gauge what someone's reason for reading is. Sometimes it's just to kill time, sometimes it's for the entertainment value of it, and sometimes it's to experience great literature. And this is one of those experience great literature reads, but don't take it to the beach.
All right, my new book I picked up is Orwell's Roses by Rebecca Solnit, partly because of the Orwell connection with the poster, but also because this is like an old friend to me, this book. I have had this book on my shelf for about 2 years. I think it came out last year, and I had the hardback of it and actually started reading it and was really enjoying it. And then I don't know what happened. Probably we were reading for the Booker Prize or something, and it got set aside, and I've never quite managed to go back to it. But it's really lovely. It's all about his interest in gardening. Rebecca Solnit, as anyone who's read her will know, her books are very much sort of about her and her thoughts and ruminations, and often they involve physical journeys or walks, but also then they're anchored to a subject that's rich in meaning. And I just felt like Orwell's Roses was a perfect synthesis of all of that. She goes to visit his garden, and she's struck by the fact that the things that he planted are still there. And I think he had quite a difficult life. I think he was in many ways not a happy man. And so it's this rich, emotionally resonant subject that she explores beautifully. So finding it here on your shelf, I was like, oh yeah, I must finish that book. And it has a beautiful cover as well. All right, tell me about your last one.
My last one, this is a book that I would always recommend to people. It happens to be a new book, because the problem with recommending a book over and over is that you really cannot have control over your inventory. So secondhand books are hard to keep in stock when you're constantly recommending them. But the book I want to recommend is The Juniper Tree by Barbara Comyns, who is a British novelist who wrote kind of between the 1950s and the 1980s, I think. Have you heard of her?
I feel like I'm looking a bit blank because I haven't ever read her, but I feel like she's in that category with Barbara Pym. Is she one of these people who's been rediscovered or keeps being rediscovered?
Yeah. She's a Barbara who keeps getting rediscovered.
Right.
And for a while, I had this reading program for myself, which was sort of the anti-Clarice Lispector reading program, which, I mean, no shade on Clarice Lispector. She's amazing. But you know how there's like sexy authors that everybody loves and wants to read, and Clarice Lispector is one of those. And then there's all these Barbaras out there, and Gladyses and Mavises. So for a while, I was really indulging in the works of Barbara Pym, the works of Barbara Comyns, the works of Mavis Gallant, all these women who I think we have this matronly idea of them, which I think has to do with their names more than anything. I mean, not everyone can look like Clarice Lispector. obviously, but they're all so good. Barbara Comyns is so good. She has this style that I would describe as like, I mean, we talk about the trauma novel, right? That's a thing these days. She wrote trauma novels before it was cool, and she wrote them in the breeziest, most self-deprecating way, and they're just totally absorbing. Most of them are at least semi-autobiographical because she had a crazy course of events in her life, mostly involving being a single mother and making her way in the world and selling pianos and antiques and just trying to get by. The Juniper Tree, I think, came out in the mid-'80s, and it's a take on the Grimm brothers fairy tale, which is sort of about the death of a child. It's grim, but it's also very dark and engaging and magical, and all of her books are like that. The Skin Chairs, The Vet's Daughter, Our Spoons Came from Woolworths. A lot of them have been reprinted by Virago Editions, and NYRB has taken them up, but some of them are still out of print and hard to find. But I would recommend any of her books to anyone who wants to read like a real woman's voice, but also just wants to be taken on a ride that is not always pleasant, but it's undiminished by the shit that she goes through. That's all I could really say about her. But I don't know anyone who's picked her up and not enjoyed it. So Barbara Comyns, Comyns.
Great. Well, my last one I've picked up has the most fantastic cover. It's called Still Life with Woodpecker, and it's a sort of love story by Tom Robbins. I've never read any Tom Robbins, and people have recommended him to me over the years, but I've just never got around to trying him. But I love the cover of this book so much. I feel like this would be the one that...
Oh, it's a gorgeous cover.
Perhaps this is the one that I would read. Have you read him?
I have. I think I read most of Tom Robbins when I was a teenager, and he's great to read as a teenager. Not that I know what teenagers want to read these days, but he's funny, he's weird, he constructs these elaborate metaphors that are completely bonkers. Skinny Legs and All was the one that really rocked my world. There's a gonzo style to his writing that's quite fun, and they're often road novels. Give it a try, you'll like it.
So when is this edition? This is a hardback. When is this from? Well, this is more expensive than the book on growing your own aphrodisiacs. This is $25.
Yeah, I think that's the first American edition.
Yeah, 1980. I just feel like you could get a modern paperback edition of this, but this is such a beautiful old edition. This is a much nicer thing to have on your shelf, assuming that you'd like the book.
Yeah, and I think people loan out Tom Robbins. You'll read it and you'll be like, oh, you've got to read this. You pass it along to someone else.
I'm increasingly appreciative of not only having the books, but having the most beautiful version of the book I can find, particularly if it's an author I like. Often you can find beautiful old editions of things that are so much nicer than whatever it is that's just come out. Mm-hmm. So this fits very nicely into that category for me.
To have books on the shelf that you're living with, they're like these little capsules of the experience that you had of reading them, but also of whatever it is that they have inside of them. And I think it's very nice and very comforting to be surrounded by them, and when they are beautiful as well. It's wonderful. Who wouldn't want to be surrounded by books all the time?
Well, you get to live that dream every day.
I do. And I have a financial interest in having other people want to live that dream, but I'm so glad that we're approaching the end of the minimalist decor era and that we're getting back into this shabby chic, chintzy, things everywhere look, because it's great to have books all over the place. You pick them up, you put them down, you stack them up. It's fantastic. People have books all over the place. It's not just about what you're reading right now. It's about what you have read. And, you construct basically a visual worldview when you have a bookshelf. Like you're saying, these are the things that I value. These are the ideas that I value. And you get to have that as a visual backdrop to your day-to-day life, which is kind of cool, right?
So cool.
There you go.
Kim, thank you so much for your time. It's been such a pleasure to be able to come here and sit and have this conversation with you about books. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
That's nearly it for this episode. Books mentioned were A Little Book of Pussycats by Lewis Wain, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Aphrodisiacs in Your Garden by Charles Connell, Minor Detail by Adania Shibley, Orwell's Roses by Rebecca Solnit, The Juniper Tree by Barbara Comyns, and Still Life with Woodpecker by Tom Robbins. And if you can't get to Vancouver to visit the Paperhound in person, you'll find them online at paperhound.ca or on Instagram at the Paperhound. This episode of the Book Club Review was produced and edited by me, Kate Slotover. If you enjoyed the show, don't miss our website, where you can find our archive of over 100 episodes to browse through, from our Booker Prize or Women's Prize specials to regular book club chats and interviews with authors and other book industry folk. You can also sign up to our bi-weekly-ish newsletter and find out the details for our Patreon account and how to support us there. If you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at BookClubRVWPod, or get in touch with us by email at thebookclubreview@gmail.com. If you like this episode and want to help us out, please take a moment to leave us a rating and review through your podcast app of choice. It helps other listeners find us, and we are always delighted to find new reviews. But for now, thanks for listening, and happy book clubbing.